One of the things we do on this show, of course, is you never know who's going to sit in that chair, and you never know where we're going to go. And I got a call from my good friend Father Andriy from the St. Michael Ukrainian Catholic Church here in Tucson. And you've been very moved and disturbed by what's going on in Ukraine. You don't say the Ukraine. I've learned that.
Just Ukraine.
I've been very sensitive to that hanging out with these guys.
Because it makes it sound like, it's the Midwest or something, like a regional identity rather than a nation.
Right. Good morning to Father Andriy. How are you doing, sir?
Good morning. Very happy to be here.
And again, he wanted to kind of have some time to talk about what's really going down in Ukraine and the struggles with the government there and maybe who's behind the government there. And so first and foremost, Father Andriy, one of the first things we do, first segment, is we want to introduce you to our guests and just do a quick little biography of yourself. Where were you born?
I was born in the great state of New Jersey.
I forgive you. As you know, we're New Yorkers, so
right. Well,
New Jersey is always...
See, people sometimes hear a little bit of an accent in me, and so they say, where are you from? And I know they're looking for something exotic, so I usually say Nova Cesaria, which is the Latin for New Jersey.
Very good.
And then they say, well, I'm not sure that I'm exactly positive where that is. I say, well, it's just south of Nova Eborax, which is the Latin for New York.
Oh, very good.
Still, most people don't get it. So they say, could you give me another clue? And I say, it's just east of Pennsylvania. And they say, that's New Jersey. And I say, exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm the son of World War II refugees from Ukraine. My parents and my wife's parents also escaped from Ukraine. Ukraine has a distinction of having lost World War II 4 times. The Germans came, then the Russians, then the Germans, then the Russians. And so when that last onslaught was occurring, a lot of the intellectual class, the business leaders, the educated people got out of there because they knew that they would have been the first ones either killed or sent to Siberia.
So in those losing World War II 4 times, how many Ukrainians were lost during that time period?
Well, estimates are that in the 20th century, so this includes World War I, World War II, and various Stalinist genocidal events, in the 20th century, approximately 20 million Ukrainians died an unnatural death.
My Lord. And right now there are 45 million Ukrainians?
Well, right now in Ukraine there are 46 million people left. There were 52 million at independence in 1991. But this is what everything is about. When the country became independent, the people who were in power before stayed in power. They just changed their names and their titles, and the same corrupt political class remained in power. And so they've been raping the country for the last several decades, and the poor are getting poorer. And Ukraine is not a poor country.
Explain to people. They say it's about the size of Texas, right? The country is about the size of Texas. It's been called the breadbasket of Europe because...
It's larger than France or Germany, but it's lost 6 million of its population in the last 2 decades.
Now, when you say
people are leaving.
Leaving, okay.
People are leaving because they just can't support their families, and so they're looking for work elsewhere.
Now, as a priest for the Ukrainian Catholic Church, and hanging out with you and your congregation, and my brother, of course, who's a member of your church, you talked about how many countries the Ukrainian Catholic Church is in right now. What is that?
Right. Well, we have structures,
right.
Dioceses, bishops in Ukraine, in Poland, in Germany, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Italy, Spain.
You're the classic academic.
UK.
You give me every country possible.
Right.
How many countries are you guys in?
Well, I've never counted them, but we're in Eastern and Western Europe, we have 9 dioceses in North America, another couple in South America, and also we're in Australia.
So I assume this is part of this kind of this fleeing. This is part of the 6 million people.
There are 4 waves of Ukrainian immigration, of leaving Ukraine, and that was at the end of the 19th, very beginning of the 20th century was the first wave. The second wave was between the 2 world wars. The third wave was after World War II. That's my parents.
Okay.
Okay, so like my mother escaping to Germany and gets taken by the Nazis for slave labor.
Right.
That's called good luck. But luckily, the regime ended in a few months, and so she was free. But
now she met your dad in America?
She met my father in Munich.
Okay.
He was actually her professor, and then they emigrated.
You're
to
the son of her
States.
Professor?
Yes.
Shocking.
And the son of a very devout man. I come from a long line of priests, goes back about 400 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Because we have married priests, of course. We're part of the Catholic Church, but we've always had married priests since apostolic times. And the families of priests are very often the ones who not only tend to matters of the faith, but also keep the culture, the language, and the history alive. And that's why I'm here today.
Now, the Ukraine, I just said the Ukraine. Bad, Chris.
Yeah.
In the Ukraine, we talk about the breadbasket of Europe.
Of Europe.
Because it's kind of very similar to the American.
It has some of the best soil. Unlike the American Midwest,
right,
which needs a lot of extra irrigation, Ukraine doesn't need that. It's got just the right amount.
It's in that perfect spot in the world.
Right, and it's got loess, L-O-E-S-S. That's some of the best soil in the world. Less is more. It is very, very productive, and so it's a naturally rich country with a very highly educated population.
What other natural resources or things define?
They have iron, manganese, coal. One thing they lack, though, is enough natural gas and oil of their own, and that's where our northeast neighbor, Russia, pushes its weight around, because
Gotcha.
Ukraine, like most of Europe, is now highly dependent on Russian oil and gas. That's where all of Putin's money is from. That's how he's basically a petrostate.
Now, how long has the Ukrainian Catholic Church been around?
The Ukrainian Catholic Church stems from, it's one of the heirs of the baptism of St. Vladimir that was back in the year 988. Ukraine was a free country then, an independent country then, and it accepted Christianity in 988, and it fell in the year 1240 when the Mongol hordes of Genghis Khan decimated society. And so that's when neighbors moved in, the Lithuanians, then the Poles, and then later the Muscovites, those people from Moscow, who at that time were known as Muscovites. They later changed their names to Russian in order to justify the fact that they were going after our lands.
Now, were you called the Ukrainian Catholic Church back in those days? Or?
No, you would have simply said the church. You might have said the Orthodox Church, just the Christian Church.
Were they Constantinople?
Yes, we received the faith from Constantinople.
Okay.
And so we were aligned with the Eastern Orthodox communion of churches, centered in Constantinople. However, remember, in 988, when we accepted Christianity, we were still in full communion with the Christian West, with Rome. And so our bishops felt that it was a good idea in 1596 to reestablish full and visible communion with Rome. And from that point on, the Ukrainian Church splits into those who want communion with Rome they're called Ukrainian Catholics, and those who don't want communion with Rome, called Ukrainian Orthodox.
Gotcha.
And then, to add to the confusion, our northeastern neighbors also control a large segment of the Orthodox believers in something called the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. So there's Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kievan Patriarch and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarch.
Father, my head hurts right now.
Yeah,
so
I can see.
Let's go pay bills. We'll get to your phone calls. 790-2040 is the phone number, and we are going to dive right into what's going on right now in Ukraine and Kyiv. And so Ed Alexander is spinning your tunes, little national anthem of Ukraine. So we got Father Andriy Chirovsky. He is from St. Michael Ukrainian Catholic Church here in Tucson. And we're going to go deep on this one, guys and girls. So you're on the D. Simone Daily Double, 790-2040. 790-2040 is the phone number with Father Andriy Chirovsky from St. Michael Ukrainian Catholic Church. And, I was asking about the flag, because it's very simple. The top half is blue and the bottom half is golden. And I asked you, what did that mean? And you said?
The blue is the blue skies, and the yellow is the wheat fields, which are abundant in Ukraine.
Nice and simple. Love it. 790-2040. Let's go to the phones. Bill number 2, what's going on, bud? You're on with Chris and Father Andriy. What's up?
Hey, good morning. Good morning, Father Andriy. Thanks for coming on so you can bring some light to this whole thing. And I saw on a business show, and maybe you can comment on this, that if I have my numbers right, in this country, it was run really by just a handful of oligarchs. And I think they said something like 50% of the wealth of the country was in the hands of 5% of the people. Does that sound about right to you?
That could even actually be low.
Really?
You see, what they did was, after Ukraine proclaimed independence, the old communists went and they privatized national holdings. So they would sell things like a steel plant to themselves for $500. And that steel plant is worth $500,000. No, $500 million. Yeah. And they sell it to themselves for $500. So you have instant millionaires, multimillionaires, billionaires. The son of the ex-president of Ukraine is a dentist, but he's like a billionaire, as Senator McCain aptly put it. Now, dentistry is a lucrative profession, but it's not that lucrative.
Yes.
And the president of Ukraine built himself a $75 million mansion. But his salary, which he reported on his tax forms, was $25,000 a year.
Yeah. Well, this, what they were showing here, I saw the palace and stuff and what they were living in. But, that's not true privatization isn't really how that went down. That was nothing short of looting, just literally looting a country by a few handful of people that I don't know why they could get away with it. Did they have the army behind them and something like that, or what?
You see, the Ukrainian people had been oppressed for so long that they just accepted that, I guess this is the way it has to be.
Wow.
And it's taken 20 years of independence where people can actually travel to the West and see that you don't have to live this way. I'll give you a little anecdote. I once had an argument with a fellow I was working with in Ukraine. He was considerably younger, and so he didn't have a very good memory of things before the fall of the Soviet Union. And I I told him that the government used to take 90% of everything and leave 10% to the population. And he said, no, couldn't have been that. It must have been the opposite. They took 10% and they left 90% for the people. I said, okay, there's a farmer standing right here. Let's go ask him. So we went up to him and said, excuse me, I say that the government took 90%, left 10% for the people. My friend here says that the government only took 10% and left 90%. Which is right? And the farmer said, you're both wrong. The government took everything.
Oh, yeah.
Anything we needed, we had to steal back. Yeah. Now, you see how deep then the corruption goes.
Right.
That you have to steal in order to live.
To survive. Well, I also heard where, and I originally came from the grain belt, of America here. The Ukraine is, or maybe still is, the largest wheat exporter in the world. Is that right?
I'm not up on that. I can't tell you whether that is still true, but it is certainly, it's got the best soil.
Yeah.
For that. It's got the right atmospheric conditions as well, so you don't have to bring in extra irrigation. And so it is extremely, extremely productive. During both World Wars, the Germans used to come with boxcars and take the topsoil from Ukraine and take it to Germany. Because the topsoil doesn't run a couple of inches. It runs about 2 feet. And so it's extremely rich. But that's not the only wealth that Ukraine has. It's got a very highly educated, very highly skilled population that gets paid next to nothing. The old Soviet anecdote was, the government pretends to pay us, and we pretend to work. Yeah. And that causes just massive stagnation. And these guys come in and, like you said, loot the country. I sometimes use the metaphor rape. Ukraine has been raped.
All these oligarchs are all going to be hanging out in Hyde Park in London, and if they can just get rid of those guys and maybe somehow get back and resell those assets, back to the rightful people, the owners and stuff, and get this thing going again. But I appreciate you coming in, and I'll sign off and listen in. Thank you,
Billy. Thanks for the call. So I was telling you during my research on this story, I ran across this Tatiana Zakharchenko, and I'm just going to read it. It's called Ukraine: Corruption Doesn't Capture It. It's called. Since it became an independent state 23 years ago, Ukraine has been looted by its structure of government at all levels and those close to it. The word, quote, corruption is not adequate to describe present-day Ukraine, in fact, distorts reality. Western listeners, often aware of corruption in their own countries, or counties, and certainly it exists everywhere else, shrug their shoulders and remain unimpressed. But it was taking place in Ukraine all these years and accelerated rapidly under the current government goes far beyond corruption. It is a policy of looting the country, transformed over the last several years into systematic and institutionalized extortion that reached all the way down into society, after not much was left to be stolen at the top.
Right, and all of this is a legacy of the Soviet Union and before that of the Russian Empire, of being treated as slaves that are only there to increase production so that the overlords can take the wealth.
What I want to do when we come back from break is I want you to get a little deeper on the psychology of being a Ukrainian in relation to after taking all of this abuse for a century. The psychology of the people, this is why it took 20 years. I want to get into that a little bit more. So we come back. We got Father Andriy Chirovsky, and we are talking about the what's going on in Ukraine, where the people are finally look like they're fed up.
They're not going to take it anymore.
I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore, as they say in network. So it's the D. Simone Daily Double. If you got a question for the Father Andriy, 790-2040 is the number. I can listen to this chants all day long. So double down, Tucson.
This is Bill Buckmaster, State Transportation Chair Steve Christie, Tuesday at noon on Buckmaster on KVOI, Tucson's Intelligent Voice.
I was going to translate this one, but it's going a little too fast for me. Welcome back to the D. Simone Daily Double. We have Father Andriy Chirovsky sitting in today. We're talking about the Ukrainian... What are we calling this? An uprising? What are we calling this?
I think you could call it a revolution.
Revolution. Just to tell you how bad, going back to my Zakharchenko article about this, we talked about... according to a government minister in each department, employees were forced to contribute part of their monthly salary, the money flowing up the pyramid to those on top. Any small business owner in Ukraine who hasn't lost their company outright to physical threats or shady financial maneuvers ratified by corrupt courts know the necessity of paying large bribes to the government officials just to keep the doors open.
Large bribes, medium bribes, small bribes.
I mean,
it was all bribes.
We'll take everything.
Here's a great story for you. I used to travel a lot to Ukraine to help out the seminaries get back on their feet. You know, our church, the Ukrainian Catholic Church, was the world's largest banned religious body from 1945 till 1989. And so when we came out of the underground with 5 million people in 1989, no seminaries, we have to reestablish. We now have the only Catholic university on the territory of the former Soviet Union, and I helped with that. But anyways, I used to travel a lot to Ukraine, and on these trips, you know, I would instinctively buckle up when I sat in the car. And people would say, oh, you don't have to wear a seatbelt here because there's no police in this area. And I would say, I'm not wearing the seatbelt for the police. I'm wearing it for me. These roads are horrible. And they would say, oh, don't you know that seatbelts were invented by the government in order to give a pretext for the police to get bribes off of people? And I just thought, well, that's such paranoid thinking. I just can't deal with it, okay? A few years later, I come back to Ukraine, and I'm given a ride by the chief of police of a mid-sized city in Ukraine. And I sit down next to him in the front seat, and I buckle up. He says, oh, you don't have to buckle up. You're driving with me. I'm the chief of police. And I said, I'm putting on the seatbelt for safety. He says, those things aren't for safety. Don't you know that the government created those things so that we could get bribes off of people? Now, that's the chief of police.
Yeah, I mean, this is... Now, so my thing is the psychology of the Ukrainian people leading up to this point. This is why it finally took 20 years for them. I mean, I know you said, and we talked about the extended World War II went to 1953,
right,
and there was Ukrainian insurgents.
Right. The Ukrainian Insurgent Army fought the Soviets until 1953, and in pitched battles until that long. And then there were still individuals who continued even further. Okay, but let's go back to the fact that in the 20th century, 20 million Ukrainians met an unnatural death.
Right.
You think that might have a little bit of effect on
I agree.
Quashing initiative to rise up?
I agree.
When every family had not one person, but many people who were killed in one way or another. It makes you live in fear. It makes you live in a desperation and a depression.
So what was the spark of this? There's always that spark that gets something like this going.
Well, you know, it started with the fact that people are saying, look, we're the largest country in Europe, a completely European country, because Russia is bigger, but Russia is both a European and an Asian country. Ukraine is completely European. We're a European country. Why can't we live like Europe does?
Sure.
After the last 20 years, people have traveled back and forth. They have seen what it's like. And So the president, Yanukovych, was saying, oh yes, we'll sign this association agreement with the European Union. Don't worry about it. I'm taking care of it. And then at the last minute, he pulls out and cuts a deal with Putin, with Russia.
And what was that deal?
Well, it was to not sign the association with the European Union, and Putin would give him $15 billion in loans to keep the Ukrainian economy afloat, because the government was near default. So he went with that, and the people started demonstrating, but very peaceful demonstrations. So then I heard this brilliant analysis by this one bishop in Ukraine. He said, it was kind of like the Pharaoh and the people of Israel. God hardened Pharaoh's heart, sent 10 plagues, and the guy just couldn't see it. He just couldn't see that what he needed to do was let these people go. And so just dug himself deeper and deeper and deeper. So they started attacking these students in the square. People said, hey, you don't do that. That's bad. So more people came to the square. Then they started roughing up other people, and even there were a few deaths. Then more people showed up in the square. Then the government passed, like complete idiots, they passed this law saying you can't demonstrate anymore. These draconian dictatorial laws. Well, you do that, and then all over the country, revolt starts springing up. And then they set snipers to shoot at the people.
Now you said you guys were watching online.
Yeah, we were watching a live feed, and we saw these guys go out with their plywood shields and cobblestones from the street were their weapons. And the government sent guys with machine guns, Kalashnikovs, to mow them down. And when they were shot at, they didn't just shoot at arms or legs. They went for the head, the neck, or the heart. So these were shots to kill by expert snipers. And the government kept doing these kind of things. They were actually preparing the army to come in and to proclaim a state of emergency, martial law, and it's at that point that the parliament said, no, you can't do this, and they stripped the president of his power, and now he's hiding somewhere.
So people know, what is the benefit for Putin to keep this? Is Yanukovych, is that his name, Yanukovych?
Yes.
He's basically a stooge for
Putin? Yeah, he's a stooge for Putin. I think Putin has been taken by surprise. He didn't think that the Ukrainian people would rise up like this. It's very uncomfortable for him to have all of this happening right next door. Because, Russian and Ukrainian are two different languages. But Russian and Ukrainian are like Italian and Spanish. Okay? If you speak clearly, you can understand much of what the other is saying.
Right.
And so you can bet that the Russians are listening in to what's happening. If the Russian population gets the idea that you can actually overthrow a dictator,
sure,
that's bad news for Putin.
Well, and I assume also for Putin, it's still a direct source into a lot of natural resources.
Right, natural resources, a very important trading partner. So he's torn because he wants it to be controlled the way he controls Russia.
Right.
But he needs it to thrive so that he can trade with Ukraine, sell his gas, sell his oil. That's important to him. So he's in a tough spot, but we're still afraid. There was a spokesman for the Moscow Patriarchate, the Russian Orthodox Church, who said that the time has come for Russia to intervene militarily in Ukraine to save our fraternal Ukrainian people from this infection of ideas from the West.
Wow. That sounds like an old 1980s Cold War movie.
Exactly. And that's the rhetoric. Russian media is consistently portraying the Ukrainian opposition as fascists and Nazis. It's so absurd. It would be laughable if they weren't holding the line on this and consistently repeating. I mean, these are people who lost millions and millions of their population to the Nazis. Why would they want to be Nazis? It's the most absurd accusation ever. And they're trying to rid themselves of a totalitarian regime. No, they're not anything near Nazis. They are freedom-loving people who want to be ruled democratically. And they now don't trust any politicians. And this is a dangerous moment in Ukrainian history, because they've lost faith in just about everybody.
Sure. Well, they got to start over again. I know there was talk about elections in May or something like that.
Elections in May to both the parliament and the presidency.
8:42 in the morning, 790-2040 is the phone number. Let's go to John on line 2. John, you're on with Chris and Father Andriy. What's going on, John?
Good morning, Father Andriy. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning.
I follow this with great interest. I think Ukraine needs to be unified and independent. If you look at the map, the eastern part of Ukraine is right under the Russian belly. And this reminds me so much of 1968. I was in Czechoslovakia. That's my background. I was born here. My wife is Slovak. I speak Russian. I taught it for years. That's what I did in the Air Force. You cannot trust the Russians. They are now calling Putin or Putin Putler, combining the words Putin and Hitler or Hitler in Russia. Did you know that?
I did not.
That's very interesting. I thought Medvedev had some degree of independence. I heard him last night. Not so. He's just a puppet. I was in these countries in 1968, and I saw firsthand the oppression of Gustav Husak in Czechoslovakia. I studied in Romania. I saw Ceausescu destroy towns there, Todor Zhivkov in Bulgaria. It's the same thing all over again. Ukraine needs to stand firm, be unified, because to have that country broken up into two parts would be disastrous.
I agree with you 100%. And, you know, this is something that I have to mention that you don't hear in the media. There is actually very little appetite in Ukraine for splitting up the country. This is what the Russians would want everybody to believe, that the east of Ukraine, where there are many Russian speakers, is very frightened by all this, wants to attach itself to Russia. No, that's not the case. There are some people who have those kind of ideas, but it's a very small minority. As a matter of fact, one of their great fears is that the Russian language will be persecuted. You know that under Yanukovych, the prime minister of Ukraine was a man who couldn't speak Ukrainian. Can you imagine if the Speaker of the House or the Senate Majority Leader couldn't speak English?
Yep.
And just spoke some other language and expected everybody to understand him? It just boggles the mind. The Russians are not going to be wiped out. If anybody gets wiped out, it's the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian intellectuals from Western Ukraine, the supposedly greatly nationalistic and scary part of Ukraine, the intellectuals from there have already issued a plea to treat the Russian minority with respect, to give guarantees that any Russian-speaking citizen of Ukraine can get government services in Russian, that if he turns to the government in Russian, they need to respond to him in Russian. If he's in court and he needs to be protected and the trial needs to be in Russian for the sake of the Russian speaker. I mean, I don't see Russians being threatened. The only ones who want you to believe this is the Russians and people who have bought their line that, Russia is going to have to come in and save the Russians in Ukraine. No, a lot of those Russians were on Independence Square, which we now call Dignity Square, because it's all about human dignity. And it's not about just Ukrainian nationalism. It's being allowed to live as a human being. There were a lot of Russian speakers there. There were Jewish rabbis, Muslim imams. There were Pentecostals, Baptists, Roman Catholics, Ukrainian Orthodox, Ukrainian Catholics, praying together. This is one thing you don't see on the news at all. You see images of priests standing between the two camps, with a cross and stuff, because that's a cool visual. But what you don't see is the constant prayer going on in that square. And throughout the country, their favorite prayer is taken from the book of Isaiah. God is with us. Understand, all you nations, and submit, for God is with us. That's the comfort that they get.
Hey, John, thanks for the great call, sir. I got to go pay some bills.
Sure.
Have a great day. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, John.
Thank you very much.
All right, it's Christy Simone, Father Andriy. It's the D. Simone Daily Double, 790-2040. We'll get to your phone calls, those who are on hold. And this is your last shot to get your questions in on what's going on in Ukraine right now. So double down, Tucson.
Politics and pop culture with Michael Medved from 1 to 4, live intelligent talk on 1030 KVOI, The Voice.
I know you're biased, but is it tough to learn Ukrainian?
Ukrainian is a very highly inflected language. That means it's all word endings. It's completely unlike English. It's completely phonetic.
Right.
So it's easy to learn how to read it because there's only one way you can possibly read anything. You don't have this nonsense that we have in English where you write it one way, you read it completely differently. But it is complex in that it has all those different. There's 7 cases.
I try to follow along during liturgy at St. Michael's, and it's a challenge. Let's just say that. I love it.
Yeah.
But
well, it's a different language
I need challenges,
structure.
Father.
I grew up. Ukrainian was my first language. I learned English when I went to school.
Okay.
You can't not learn English. I don't know what it is with people who are afraid that they can't learn English. They have to have some kind of other education. You have to try to not learn English in this country. I just don't get it. And people should be teaching their children other languages at home. It expands your mind. I grew up with these 2 languages. Ukrainian I spoke at home. English I spoke at school. And now I can work in 12 languages because I had something to hang those languages on.
I got to get you to do a Ukrainian liturgy all in Spanish. Then we'll work.
I've done that, and I did it once in Puerto Rico.
790-2040 is the phone number. This is your last chance to get on with Father Andriy talking about the Ukraine. Let's go to Cynthia on line 3. Cynthia, thanks for holding. How can we help you today?
No, thank you, Father. Actually, you already answered the question I was going to ask with the last caller about how realistic is the possibility of partition. But I decided to hang on the line just to say thank you for being on the show and responding to the questions.
Well, thank you, and please pray for the Ukrainian people, and please tell our representatives in the federal government that they need to stand by the Ukrainian people, because if Ukraine falls, that's just the beginning of the rebuilding of a Russian empire, and that's not good for anybody.
Cynthia, thanks for listening, and thanks for your call. It's 8:53 in the morning. Let's go to Barney on line 4. Barney, good morning, sir.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Hey.
Father, I also wanted to say thank you for this spectacular insight that we just can't get in our main media here. It's so encouraging that these people are reaching out for more freedom in Eastern Europe, and it's so ironic that we are seeing more and bigger government here. The contrast is astonishing. We used to be the beacon of the world, and if Kyiv and the people in Ukraine want to be a new beacon, well, God bless them, and those folks are in our prayers.
Barney, it's kind of spooky on how the cronyism and corruption we talk about are in our own country, in our own state, in our own county. It's like the guys in the Ukraine have just taken it to the ultimate zenith.
Well, we're talking about the fact that Ukraine needs Europe. But you know what?
Europe needs Ukraine.
Right, because first of all, they haven't lost their faith. They're still very deeply faithful people. They actually pray. And the second is, they have come to the realization, you'll hear this all over Ukraine right now, we made the mistake of thinking that if we elected one or another person, they would take care of things for us. Now we know we have to take care of things for ourselves.
That's a lesson we need to reiterate here. And Europe, Western Europe, has lost their faith. And that's wonderful that it may see a resurgence with this example of not only faith, but freedom, because Western Europe, they're starting to glimmer that big government is not the answer. And may this wave progress, and God bless them, and God bless you, Father. Thank you.
Barney, thanks for the nice call, sir. 790-2040 is the phone number. So you talked about to Cynthia and Barney about appealing to your federal officials. We have Congress people here. We have senators in Arizona. What should the U.S. do now in this situation?
The U.S. First thing, don't draw any more lines. Okay.
Leave Barack alone.
That's useless. When the president said, if they step over the line, there'll be consequences, the people in Ukraine said, we've heard this one before.
Well, look at all the dead women, children, and men in Syria right now.
Right. So that's not what we need. What we need right now is Ukraine needs economic support. Ukraine needs, yes, it needs a bailout, and for that, the European Union, the International Monetary Fund, and the U.S. are going to have to step up in order to help them so they don't careen out of control economically after having been robbed blind for so many years. First by the Soviet Union, first by the Russian Empire, then the Soviet Union, and then the legacy of all of that, the corrupt Ukrainian politicians.
Let me ask you a question.
Now.
You brought up in the earlier part of the show the $500 million steel mill that someone bought after Ukrainian independence, one of these cronies, for $500. Mm-hmm. So that steel mill, what should happen to that steel mill? If hopefully you get all your democratic reforms and all, how do all these assets get redistributed?
Long term, they will need to be nationalized and then privatized correctly. That's the only way to do it. They've just nationalized Yanukovych's $75 million mansion, which he built on $25,000 a year salary. So what they're going to do is then they're going to find some good use for it. They might actually keep it. There's talk of keeping it as a museum of corruption for people to see. This is exactly what we don't want to happen.
That'd be extra impetus for me to travel to the Ukraine to Ukraine.
It is disgusting when you look at how he spent that money, which he just he literally skinned the people, and they're living below poverty line, and he was living in just disgusting opulence. And he's not the only one. All of his cronies were doing the same thing. And that's why they've all disappeared, mostly going to Russia and Belarus. But they've parked their money in Western Europe and all kind of offshore.
Hey, real quick, we're going to run out of time. First of all, what's the website for St. Michael's Ukrainian Catholic Church?
It's stmichaeltucson.org. Michael, Michael, Tucson.org. It's all one long word.
And
St. Michael
what
Tucson.
are good news sources online that, doesn't have the classic CNN spin of where people can go online to follow what's really going on in the Ukraine?
Well, I've been going to the Ukrainian language sites, but
how's the BBC on this kind of stuff?
The BBC is good. The CBC, the Canadian Broadcast Company, Canada has kind of been forgotten, but Canada actually has been doing great things behind the scenes, and not just behind the scenes, but they came out and they directly confronted Yanukovych, and they've told Putin too, because Ukrainians have a lot more clout in Canada. Canada than they do in the United States. And so the Canadians are much more acutely aware of things. So the CBC, the Canadian Broadcast Company, cbc.ca is a good source. BBC.co is another good source.